The photographer adjusted his lens in the chapel garden, while my husband stood beside a woman 30 years his junior, his thumb resting lightly against her knuckles. He turned to the small gathering and said quite plainly, "Eleanor always knew her role, but Clara is the woman I actually built this life with." I watched the sunlight catch the diamonds on her wrist and felt a sudden, absolute stillness settle over my breathing. I did not interrupt. I did not step forward. I simply kept my hands folded over my coat, feeling the heavy edge of the banking ledger tucked against the silk lining. I had already transferred the title deeds and emptied the joint operating account 3 days prior. The priest asked for the rings, and my husband reached into his pocket. I smiled, adjusted my collar, and waited. By the time the sun dipped below the tree line, the wedding would have cost him everything he thought belonged to him. If you have ever watched the person who promised to hold your hand walk away with a stranger while you stand perfectly still, you understand exactly why this story matters. Before we go further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if stories like this speak to you. And I am curious, where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it there right now? Leave a comment below and tell me. I read them when the house grows quiet. Sometimes, knowing someone else is listening makes all the difference. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 71 years old. I spent 42 years as the head archivist at the Seattle Central Library, organizing decades of municipal records and forgotten correspondence. I lived on a quiet, tree-lined street in the Cedar Ridge neighborhood, where the lawns slope gently toward the water and the morning fog clings to the asphalt until late spring. We bought the house in 1978. It is a modest cedar-sided bungalow with a wraparound porch that sags slightly toward the south side. The kitchen wall still holds a faded column of pencil marks tracing Julian's height from age 4 to 18. The third step on the back staircase creaks under any weight heavier than a cat. Arthur planted the white oak in the front yard when we moved in. He said trees outlast marriages. He said roots hold better than promises. He was a family physician who ran a small clinic 30 miles east of the city. He wore wool cardigans even in July. He carried a silver pocket watch that ticked loudly against his chest. He believed in quiet routines. He believed in checking the pulse before treating the wound. He said that exact phrase every time I rushed to pack a suitcase for a weekend trip. He said it when I wanted to call a contractor for a leaking roof. He said it in the soft, measured tone of a man who had spent decades listening to heartbeats and learning that panic rarely helps. He never raised his voice. He simply adjusted his glasses, pressed 2 fingers to a wrist, and waited for the rhythm to steady. Julian was born on a cold Tuesday in November. He arrived with a shock of dark hair and a habit of watching dust motes instead of crying. He grew up quiet. He learnt to walk by holding the hem of my cardigan. He learnt to read by tracing the letters on library return slips. When he turned 12, Arthur taught him how to wrap a blood pressure cuff. Julian held the stethoscope like it was made of glass. He never dropped it. He never rushed it. He listened to every beat as if he were waiting for a secret to reveal itself. We measured our years in library catalogue updates and prescription refills and slow Sunday dinners, where the only conversation was the weather and the price of tomatoes. We did not travel far. We did not host parties. We kept the porch light on. We swept the walkway every November. We saved every receipt in a blue tin box. We lived carefully. We lived quietly. We believed that steady hands build lasting things. Arthur kept a heavy brass desk in the study. It had 3 drawers that stuck in the summer humidity. The bottom drawer held a vintage cassette recorder and a single plastic tape, labelled only with a date. October 14th, 1998. He never mentioned it. He never moved it. He simply placed it behind a stack of discontinued medical journals and left it there. I noticed it the day I organised his tax files. I touched the plastic case. I felt the cold edge of the label. I did not ask him what was on it. I did not open it. I let it sit. It became part of the furniture. It became part of the house. It became a quiet weight I learned to carry. He left on an ordinary Tuesday. The sky was the colour of wet slate. The sprinklers clicked on at 6 in the morning. The kitchen smelled faintly of burnt coffee and lemon polish. He stood in the hallway wearing the navy blazer I bought him for his 60th birthday. He carried a single leather suitcase. He did not look at the pencil marks on the wall. He did not look at the oak tree outside the window. He walked to the door. He opened it. He closed it behind him. The latch clicked. The house stayed exactly as it was. I placed my coffee mug on the counter. I washed it in warm water. I dried it with a linen towel. I set it in the cupboard. My hands did not shake. My breath did not catch. I simply stood at the sink and watched the water run clear. That was the grief. It was not a collapse. It was a pause. It was the quiet realization that the rhythm I had counted for 40 years had finally skipped a beat. Clara arrived on a Thursday. She knocked exactly twice. She wore a pale cashmere sweater that looked soft and expensive. Her hair was pulled into a neat, low knot. Her shoes made no sound on the damp porch steps. She carried a woven tote bag filled with fresh thyme, a small jar of wildflower honey, and a leather-bound planner. She smiled before I fully opened the door. Her teeth were perfectly straight. Her eyes were the pale green of sea glass. She stepped inside and closed the distance between us. She embraced me. Her arms were careful. Her hands rested on my shoulders for 2 seconds longer than necessary. She pulled back and said she wanted to make sure I was eating properly. She said Arthur had asked her to check in. She did not say where he was. She did not explain why he left. She simply placed the honey on the kitchen counter and opened the cabinet to find a shelf. She moved my glass teacup to the left. She moved my ceramic soup bowl to the right. She arranged them by height. She did not ask where I kept them. She just did it. I watched her hands. They moved with quiet precision. I said nothing. She smiled again. She said she would be back on Saturday to sort the pantry. She turned and walked down the front path. Her footsteps left no mark on the wet concrete. She returned on Saturday morning. The sky was bright and cold. The air smelled of damp pine and wood smoke. She brought a notebook and a pen with a silver clip. She sat at my kitchen table without waiting for an invitation. She listed every prescription bottle in the medicine cabinet. She noted the expiration dates. She noted the refill schedules. She wrote them down in neat, sloping letters. She did not ask my permission. She did not look up while she worked. Julian arrived at noon. He stood in the doorway. He wore a wrinkled button-down shirt and jeans with a loose thread on the hem. His shoulders were rounded forward. His eyes were tired. He kissed my cheek. He asked if I was sleeping through the night. He did not look at Clara. He looked at the floor near the refrigerator. Clara handed him a cup of black coffee without asking. He took it. He drank it in 3 long sips. He set the mug down. He left by 1 o'clock. He did not say goodbye. Clara stayed. She organized my mail by date. She separated bills from flyers from personal letters. She placed the bills in a manila folder labeled urgent. She placed the letters in a drawer I rarely opened. She closed it softly. She said she would return on Tuesday. She said Julian would drive me to the pharmacy. She said I must be careful with my memory. She said aging affects short-term recall faster than people realize. I nodded. I poured tea. I placed the cup in front of her. I watched her hands lift it. I watched her lips touch the rim. I watched her set it down. I said nothing. The back of my neck went cold. Something tightened in my chest. I knew exactly what was happening. The first real shift arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. The grocery receipt from Tuesday morning vanished from the counter. I had written the total on it in pencil. I needed it to balance my monthly ledger. It was gone. I searched the trash. I checked the recycling bin. I looked under the mail stack. It was simply gone. The silver picture frame holding a photograph of Julian at his college graduation moved from the hallway console to the living room mantel. The angle changed. The glass caught the afternoon light differently. The reflection showed the kitchen door instead of the staircase. I did not move it back. I let it sit. I noted it. I logged it in my mind. On Friday, a new prescription appeared on the bathroom sink. The bottle was white. The label read lorazepam. 1 milligram. Take 1 tablet by mouth at bedtime. I had not seen a doctor in 9 months. I had not requested it. I did not fill it. I left it where it sat. Clara arrived on Monday morning. She looked at the bottle. She looked at me. She said the clinic ordered it for anxiety. She said stress affects the nervous system more than people realize. She said Arthur had agreed to the dosage. She said it was better to manage it early. I asked her which doctor. She smiled. She said Dr. Lynn's clinic. She said the records were already transferred. She said I must trust the process. I nodded. I turned away. I walked to the study. I sat in Arthur's chair. I traced the edge of the brass desk with my thumb. I looked at the bottom drawer. I did not pull it open. I simply listened to the house breathe. That evening I heard her voice through the closed study door. It was low and precise. She was speaking on her phone. She said Julian is compliant. She said he just wants peace. She said the power of attorney is ready. She said once it is signed, the accounts transfer. She said the house clears by December. She said the tape is gone. She said I never look. She paused. She said she is too tired to fight. The line clicked. A door closed down the hall. I stood in the hallway. I pressed my palm against the wall. I felt the vibration of the furnace. I listened to my own breathing. I did not cry. I did not move. I just stood. The floorboards felt solid beneath my feet. The silence was heavy. It was not empty. It was waiting. The pictures began to disappear slowly. First, the one of Arthur and me at the coast. Then the one of Julian holding his first fish at the lake. Then the framed certificate from the library board. Then the black and white photograph of my parents standing on their porch. Clara never announced it. She never explained. She just replaced them with landscapes, with abstract prints. With a calendar featuring botanical illustrations. The curtains on the west-facing windows were drawn by 3 o'clock. The blinds on the east side were pulled down by 4. The neighbour across the street stopped waving when I stood at the mailbox. I saw her watching from behind the glass. I saw her turn away when I raised my hand. I did not blame her. Fear travels fast in quiet neighborhoods. It spreads through closed doors. It settles in the soil. It grows in the silence. I began to watch. I kept a small notebook in my apron pocket. I wrote down times. I noted dates. I tracked the movement of objects. I recorded the words spoken in the kitchen. I memorized the tone of the voice through the door. I learned to walk softly on the stairs. I learned to leave glasses on the table without drinking from them. I learned to sit in the study and listen to the house breathe. I did not pretend to sleep. I actually slept. But I woke at 3. I lay still. I listened. I waited. I counted the minutes between the refrigerator cycling and the wind shifting in the oak tree. I measured time by sound. I measured space by silence. I did not panic. I prepared. I touched the silk lining of my coat. I felt the edge of the banking ledger. I knew the weight of it. I knew the numbers inside it. I knew exactly what they meant. The house felt different. It felt like it was shrinking. It felt like it was being measured by someone who did not live in it. I watched Clara unpack a set of porcelain cups. I watched Julian stand in the driveway. I watched his hands grip the steering wheel. I watched his knuckles turn white. He did not look at me. He did not look at her. He just stared at the asphalt. I turned away. I went inside. I closed the door. I locked it. I waited for the next step. I knew it would come soon. I knew it would be quiet. I knew it would look like kindness. I stood by the front window long after the streetlights flickered on. The sodium glow painted the wet pavement in long, pale streaks. My coat still hung by the door, heavy with the ledger pressed against the silk lining. I did not take it off. I kept one hand resting on the brass doorknob, feeling the cold metal seep into my palm. The house smelled of old paper and lemon wax, but underneath it, something sharper had settled in. It smelled like change. It smelled like a room being measured for new furniture. I walked to the kitchen and opened the drawer where Clara had tucked the personal letters. I did not pull them out. I simply ran my fingers along the wooden edge. I knew exactly which ones she had moved. I knew which ones she had left behind. I closed the drawer slowly. I did not rush. I let the silence do the work. I understood then that patience is not waiting. It is watching. The next morning, Mrs. Gable from across the street stood on her porch with a rusted watering can. She is 74. She has lived on Cedar Ridge since 1969. She used to bring me jars of blackberry jam every August. Today, she kept her eyes fixed on the hydrangeas. When I stepped onto my own porch, she did not look up. Her shoulders tensed. Her grip tightened around the plastic handle. I raised my hand anyway. I said, "Good morning." The word hung in the damp air. She finally turned. Her eyes were wide. She said they are asking about the property lines. She said a surveyor came by yesterday. She said they want to know where the fence ends. She paused. She said, "Eleanor, be careful." Then she walked back inside. Her screen door clicked shut. I stood on the step. The wind moved through the oak branches. I felt the weight of her warning settle into my ribs. It was not fear. It was confirmation. That afternoon, I heard Clara again. This time she was on the landline in the study. The door was cracked just enough for sound to slip through. She said the transfer forms are ready for Tuesday. She said the notary will witness the signature. She said Julian will bring the car. She said if she refuses, we proceed with the medical directive anyway. She said the doctor already filed the capacity notice. She said it only takes one signature to change the routing number. She said she has no reason to suspect anything. The phone receiver clicked. Footsteps crossed the hallway floorboards. I sat at the kitchen table. I placed my hands flat against the wood. I felt the grain beneath my palms. I traced a deep scratch left by a chair leg in 1983. I closed my eyes. I breathed in. I breathed out. The rhythm was steady. The house was quiet. The game was already in motion. I just had to wait for my turn to move. I knew the ledger held the exact balance. I knew the routing numbers were already shifted. I knew Arthur's voice on the tape had not been a memory. It had been a map. I folded my hands. I waited for the next knock. I knew exactly how to answer. The porcelain cups Clara unpacked replaced my everyday mugs on the open shelf above the sink. I had always kept the heavy ceramic ones where they were easiest to reach. She moved them to the back of the upper cabinet. I adjusted anyway. My hands learned to stretch higher. I reached for the water pitcher without thinking. I poured slowly. The routine shifted without permission. The morning coffee stopped appearing on the kitchen counter at 7. It arrived at 8:30, served in a small saucer with a single sugar cube. Clara said the clinic recommended reducing sodium and caffeine. She said aging bodies process stimulants differently. She said it costs less to buy the lighter roast anyway. I nodded. I drank it black. I felt the bitterness settle on my tongue. I did not complain. I let the change happen. I watched my own hands adjust to the new shelf height. I watched my fingers trace the new cup rims. I decided to say nothing. I knew how to adapt. I knew how to move quietly through altered spaces. Tom from the postal route stopped at the gate on Tuesday morning. He wore his usual faded canvas jacket. He held a bundle of utility notices and a registered letter. He looked past me toward the porch steps. He said, "Helena, the meter reader came by yesterday. He said they are asking about a secondary occupancy permit." He handed me the stack. I took it. The paper felt cool against my palms. He walked away without waiting for a reply. I stood at the iron gate. I watched his truck disappear around the corner. The phrase lingered. Secondary occupancy. It meant they were preparing the ground for someone else to stay. Something about the way he avoided my eyes made the air feel thinner. I turned back to the walkway. I carried the mail to the kitchen table. I sorted it by weight. I set the letters aside. I opened the utility notices one by one. The water bill had been duplicated. The electric account showed a new authorized user. The names were printed in clean, modern type. I traced the letters with my thumb. I felt the paper grain. I did not react. I simply noted the addition. I knew exactly who had approved it. Clara sat across from me at the dining table that afternoon. The sunlight fell in sharp rectangles across the wood grain. She opened a checkbook. She smoothed a fresh deposit slip. She looked at my hands resting on the edge of the table. She said, "You sometimes forget to sign the endorsement line, don't you?" She smiled lightly. She said it is perfectly normal. She said short-term lapses happen to everyone. I listened. I kept my posture straight. I felt the familiar tightening in my throat. I stood. I walked to the study. I needed to verify the monthly statement. I opened the bottom drawer of the brass desk. The blue metal box was gone. The box where we kept the original property deed and the archived bank statements. I pulled out the remaining folders. I checked the ledger tabs. I counted the pages. I traced the edges of the remaining documents. The deed copy was missing. The original transfer receipt from 1998 was gone. I sat on the floor, the carpet fibers pressed against my knees. I looked at the empty space where the box had rested. Dust outlined its shape. I knew exactly what had been taken. I knew exactly why. The silence in the room felt heavy. It felt calculated. I stood. I brushed the dust from my skirt. I closed the drawer. I returned to the dining room. I walked back into the space where she waited. I placed my hands flat on the table. I looked directly at her. I asked where the blue box was. I kept my voice even. I did not raise it. She set her pen down. She looked at me. Her expression did not change. She said she moved it to the safety deposit box at the downtown branch. She said Arthur instructed her to secure the sensitive files. She said the house environment attracts moisture. She said paper degrades quickly near the radiator. She did not blink. Her posture remained relaxed. She tapped the edge of the checkbook with a single finger. She said I should focus on my physical therapy. She said worrying about paper ruins the joints. The conversation ended. It went nowhere. She returned to her writing. I turned and walked to the kitchen. I filled a glass with tap water. I drank it slowly. I placed the glass in the sink. I turned on the hot water faucet. I washed my hands. I dried them thoroughly. I walked back to the hallway closet. I opened the small cabinet beside the broom. I pulled out a fresh notebook. I opened it to a blank page. I wrote the date. I wrote the time. I listed the missing items. I noted her exact words. I closed the book. I slipped it under my mattress. My breathing remained steady. My hands stopped trembling. I knew what I had to do next. That evening, I waited until the house settled into darkness. I listened to the floorboards cooling. I listened to the wind against the window pane. I stood. I walked to the study desk. I ran my fingers along the back edge of the bottom drawer. I felt a gap beneath the wood trim. I pressed my thumb into the space. A folded sheet of paper shifted. I pulled it out. It was heavy. It was cream-colored. The ink was fresh. It was a letter addressed to the county recorder. It requested a name change on the property title. It cited medical incapacity. It referenced a physician's waiver. The signature at the bottom belonged to Arthur. The date was stamped 3 days prior. I read it twice. I read the medical waiver clause. I read the transfer authorization line. My hands grew very still. I felt the paper crinkle slightly under my grip. The theft had been a rehearsal. The letter was the script. I placed the document back in the gap. I smoothed the wood trim. I turned off the study lamp. The darkness felt different now. It felt deliberate. I walked to the window. I watched the streetlights flicker on. I felt the weight of the deception settle over my shoulders. It did not crush me. It clarified me. I saw the pattern clearly for the first time. They were moving quickly. They were assuming I would not notice the paperwork. They were assuming I would accept the quiet rearrangement. I turned away from the glass. I walked back to the bedroom. I closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed. I touched the notebook under the mattress. I knew what to document next. I walked into the hallway. I stood outside the closed sunroom door. The glass was fogged with condensation. I pressed my ear gently against the wooden frame. Her voice came through clear and low. She was speaking to Julian on the phone.
She said the capacity evaluation is scheduled for Thursday morning.
She said Dr. Evans will sign the form. She said once the judge reviews the medical waiver, the trust bypasses Eleanor entirely. She paused. She said Julian already signed the consent paperwork. The line went quiet. A door clicked shut somewhere inside the room. I stepped back. I placed my palm flat against the wall. I felt the vibration of the furnace cycling on. I did not move. I let the silence fill the corridor. The fact settled inside me. They were moving the timeline forward. They were using my own doctor against me. I knew exactly how to counter it. I turned toward the kitchen. I walked softly. I did not rush. The information had been delivered. I simply had to hold it. The pictures came down. The curtains closed. By the second week, Mrs. Gable had stopped waving from across the street. The house grew quieter than it had ever been. I began to watch systematically. I kept the notebook under my mattress. I wrote down every time the front door opened. I recorded every phone call that lasted longer than 3 minutes. I noted which cabinets she opened and which she left alone. I tracked the pattern of her movements like a librarian tracking overdue returns. At night, I climbed into bed at 9:30. I turned off the lamp. I pulled the quilt to my chin. I closed my eyes. I did not sleep. I listened to the floorboards shift. I counted the steps between the hallway and the kitchen. I memorized the rhythm of her pacing. She walked with purpose. She stopped at the study door at exactly 11. She stood there for 4 minutes. She did not open it. She breathed slowly. She turned away. I lay perfectly still. I felt the mattress springs compress under my weight. I kept my breathing shallow and even. I let her believe I was gone. I let her believe the house was surrendering. The clock on the nightstand ticked past midnight. The wind brushed the oak branches against the glass. Arthur's voice returned to me then, clear and steady. Check the pulse before treating the wound. The words carried a different weight now. They were not a warning, they were a map. I felt the edge of the cassette tape case in my mind. I felt the cold plastic of the label. Something about the way she paused outside the study door made the back of my neck go cold. I opened my eyes. I stared at the ceiling. I mapped the next 3 days in my head. I knew where the signatures would fall. I knew where the numbers would shift. I knew exactly when to pull the lever. The house breathed around me. I waited. The next morning brought a different kind of quiet. It was the heavy silence of a room where decisions had already been made. Clara stood by the kitchen island talking on her phone. Her voice carried through the doorway. She said the routing number update is complete.
She said the automatic deposits will redirect by Friday. She said we just need the final signature on the medical release.
The line clicked. She set the phone down. She did not look at me. She picked up a ceramic spoon and stirred the oatmeal. I watched the steam rise. I kept my hands folded over my apron. The fabric felt rough against my palms. I did not speak. I simply noted the timing. I drove to the pharmacy at noon. The parking lot was slick with rain. The automatic doors slid open with a mechanical sigh. The air inside smelled of antiseptic and mint gum. David stood behind the counter. He had filled Arthur's prescriptions for 22 years. He wore a faded blue smock. His glasses slid down his nose. He handed me a small paper bag containing vitamins. He did not release the bag immediately. His fingers lingered on the edge. He looked past my shoulder toward the window. He said Clara filled the new authorization yesterday. He said she requested a 90-day supply. He said the dosage is unusually high for a woman your age. He paused. He said, please double-check the instructions with your own doctor. I took the bag. The paper crinkled softly. I thanked him. I walked to the exit. The bell above the door chimed once. I sat in my car. I held the bag on my lap. I opened it. I pulled out the receipt. The name on the prescription label was mine. The prescribing physician was listed as Dr. Evans. The date was 3 days ago. I had not seen Dr. Evans in 4 years. I stared at the ink until it blurred. Something inside me settled into a hard, cold place. When I returned home, the hallway table was bare. The heavy oak sideboard where I kept the silver candelabra and Arthur's medical journals had been pushed against the far wall. The top was cleared. Only a single potted fern remained. I walked into the living room. The rug had been rolled and tied with twine. It leaned against the bookshelf. I felt a sudden pull in my chest. I walked to the kitchen. I opened the top drawer near the sink. The silver serving spoons were gone. The linen placemats were gone. The heavy copper mixing bowl Arthur used for everything had vanished. I stood very still. I traced the outline on the wooden surface where the bowl had rested for 3 decades. The wood was lighter where it had been covered. I knew what this meant. They were liquidating the house. They were preparing it for sale. I did not cry. I did not call the police. I walked to the dining room. I sat at the head of the table. I placed my hands flat on the wood. I closed my eyes. I breathed slowly. I mapped the losses. I noted the pattern. I understood the strategy. Clara found me there 20 minutes later. She carried a stack of mail. She set it down gently. She did not sit. She stood near the window. She said the estate sale company will arrive on Monday. She said it is better to clear the clutter before the winter. She said you have too many heavy things to move. She said we should simplify your space. I looked at her. I kept my voice level. I asked who authorized the sale. She smiled. It was a small, practiced movement. She said the doctor recommended a lighter environment. She said Arthur agreed before he left. She said it is standard procedure for downsizing. She did not blink. Her hands remained perfectly still. I stood. I walked to the kitchen. I turned on the tap. I let the water run. I washed a single glass. I dried it. I placed it in the rack. I turned off the light. The silence in the house felt different. It felt hollow. It felt like a shell waiting to be cracked open. That evening, I heard them in the kitchen again. I stood at the top of the stairs. The wooden banister was cool against my palm. Their voices drifted up through the floor vents. Julian spoke first. His tone was flat. He said I do not like selling the silver. He said it was her mother's. Clara answered immediately. Her voice was calm. She said she will not notice it is gone. She said her memory is already fragmenting. She said focus on the transfer forms. She said once the judge signs the capacity order, the trust liquidates automatically. She said we will have the keys by New Year. The floor vent hummed softly. I pressed my ear closer to the grate. I heard a chair leg scrape across the tile. I heard Julian exhale. I heard nothing else. I stepped back. I walked down the hall to my room. I closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed. I opened my notebook. I wrote the time. I wrote the words. I closed the cover. I slid it under the pillow. The days blurred into a careful routine. I moved through the rooms like a ghost in my own home. I watched her measure the windows for new blinds. I watched her photograph the empty bookshelves. I watched Julian stand in the driveway talking on his phone. His shoulders stayed hunched. His eyes never met mine when I passed him. I adjusted to the empty spaces. I learned to walk around the rolled rugs. I learned to eat from paper plates. I learned to sleep without turning on the lamp. At night, I lay perfectly still. I listened to the house settle. I listened to her footsteps on the stairs. I counted the pauses between them. I mapped the rhythm of their planning. I kept my breathing slow. I kept my hands relaxed. I let them believe the quiet was surrender. It was not surrender. It was preparation. The oak tree outside the window stood bare against the grey sky. Its branches tapped the glass in a steady rhythm. Arthur's voice returned to me then, clear and steady. Check the pulse before treating the wound. The words settled over my breathing. They carried a new weight now. They were a promise. I opened my eyes. I stared at the ceiling. I felt the heavy edge of the banking ledger pressed against the silk lining of my coat. The weight was familiar. It was grounding. Something about the way the streetlight caught the dust on the floorboards made the back of my neck go cold. I turned toward the wall. I waited. I knew exactly what would happen next. Ruth stood at my gate before the mail carrier even reached my walkway. She wore a dark wool coat and carried a leather satchel slung across her shoulder. She did not smile. She did not step onto my porch. She simply looked past my shoulder toward the kitchen window and said one sentence. She said they changed the filing date to Tuesday. She turned and walked down the street. Her boots struck the asphalt with a steady rhythm. She did not look back. I stood on the step. The wind bit through my sweater. I turned inside and locked the door. I did not check the mail. I did not remove my coat. I walked straight to the study. I stood before the brass desk. I pulled the bottom drawer open. The wood groaned. My fingers brushed past the stacked medical journals. I felt the cold plastic edge of the cassette case. I lifted it. It was heavier than I remembered. I set it on the desk. I found the battery-operated player tucked behind a ledger of tax returns. I wiped the dust from the casing. I inserted the tape. I pressed play. The mechanism clicked. A hiss filled the room. Then his voice. It was calm. It was steady. It sounded exactly as it had on a Tuesday morning in 1998. He said the trust was structured to bypass probate entirely. He said the Cedar Ridge deed sits inside the Eleanor Vance irrevocable trust. He said the operating accounts require dual authorization. He said if anyone tries to force a transfer, they will hit a court injunction. He said I am the sole trustee. He said the tape is proof of intent. He said, check the pulse before treating the wound. The tape stopped. The room went still. I sat in his chair. I traced the armrest with my thumb. My hands did not shake. My breathing slowed. I knew exactly where the documents were kept. I knew which drawer held the original deed. I knew which folder contained the trust certification. I opened the center drawer. I pulled out a thick manila envelope. I turned it over. The seal was intact. I broke the wax. I spread the papers across the desk. The notary stamps were clear. The signatures were verified. The dates matched. I looked at the clock. It was 10 in the morning. I had 4 days. I closed the drawer. I stood. I walked to the kitchen. Arthur was not there. Clara was. She stood at the counter slicing lemons into thin rounds. Julian sat at the table. He stared at his coffee cup. The steam curled upward in lazy spirals. Clara looked up when I entered. She wiped her hands on a linen towel. She walked to the head of the table. She pulled out the wooden chair. She sat. She folded her hands. She looked directly at me. She spoke in a voice that carried no heat. It carried only precision. She said Arthur renewed his vows with his mistress on our 40th anniversary. The words landed on the table. They did not bounce. They sank. I watched her hands. They rested perfectly flat on the wood. Her eyes did not move. She did not blink. She did not breathe. Julian looked at the floor. His jaw tightened. The refrigerator hummed. The faucet dripped once. I made a decision. I would not argue. I would not cry. I would not explain. I would simply begin. I waited until they left for the afternoon appointment. The front door clicked shut. The car engine faded down the street. I stood in the hallway. I walked to the study. I locked the door behind me. I pulled the blinds. I placed the trust documents on the desk. I retrieved my old digital camera from the closet shelf. The battery was charged. I wiped the lens with a microfiber cloth. I positioned the papers flat under the desk lamp. I adjusted the focus ring. I pressed the shutter. The flash did not fire. The click was soft. I turned to the next page. I photographed the trustee designation. I photographed the asset schedule. I photographed the notary signatures. I moved to the filing cabinet. I pulled the drawer containing the bank statements. I photographed every routing number. I photographed every account balance. I photographed every transfer restriction. I worked in silence. My hands were steady. My breathing was shallow. I did not rush. I let the machine capture the truth. When the memory card was full, I ejected it. I placed it inside a hollowed-out dictionary on the library shelf. I returned the camera to the closet. I straightened the rug. I wiped my fingerprints from the desk lamp. I unlocked the door. I stepped into the hallway. The air felt cooler. The house felt larger. I walked to the kitchen. I filled a glass with tap water. I drank it slowly. I placed the glass in the sink. I turned off the light. I stood by the window. I watched the street. The sky was pale. The trees were bare. I felt something I had not felt in months. It was not grief. It was readiness. I ran into Thomas at the grocery store 2 days later. He worked in the produce section for 12 years. He wore a green apron and a faded baseball cap. He was bagging apples. He saw me approach. He stopped weighing the fruit. He looked at my cart. He looked at my face. He said, "You seem lighter." I nodded. I said, "I am walking better." He placed the last apple in the bag. He handed me the receipt. He said, "The store manager asked about your account." I said, "Let him ask." Thomas smiled faintly. He said, "He knows a thing or two about quiet people." He went back to weighing oranges. I walked to the checkout line. I placed my items on the conveyor belt. The cashier scanned them without speaking. I paid with cash. I carried the bags to the car. I drove home. The steering wheel felt firm under my grip. The radio was off. I listened to the tires on the pavement. I did not check the mirrors. I knew what was coming. I knew where the trap was set. The isolation was complete. The curtains stayed drawn. The porch light remained off. By the second week, the neighbor's dog stopped barking when I passed. The street felt like a stage waiting for actors. I moved through the rooms like a ghost in my own life. I adjusted to the silence. I learned to walk without sound. I learned to leave doors ajar. I learned to watch the dust settle on surfaces I no longer touched. I kept the notebook under the mattress. I wrote down every conversation. I logged every phone call. I noted every shifted object. I memorized the rhythm of Clara's footsteps. She walked with certainty. She stopped at the study door every night. She stood there for 3 minutes. She did not open it. She turned away. I lay perfectly still. I kept my breathing shallow. I let her believe the house was surrendering. It was not surrender. It was preparation. The oak tree outside the window stood bare against the grey sky. Its branches tapped the glass in a steady rhythm. Arthur's voice returned to me then, clear, steady, unbroken. Check the pulse before treating the wound. The words settled over my breathing. They carried a new weight now. They were a promise. I opened my eyes. I stared at the ceiling. I felt the heavy edge of the banking ledger pressed against the silk lining of my coat. The weight was familiar. It was grounding. Something about the way the streetlight caught the dust on the floorboards made the back of my neck go cold. I turned toward the wall. I waited. I knew exactly what would happen next. Clara came back on Thursday evening. She carried a stack of legal folders. She placed them on the dining table. She sat. She opened the top folder. She smoothed the pages. She looked at me. She said the capacity hearing is set for Monday morning. She said Dr. Evans will testify. She said the judge will sign the transfer order by noon. She said Julian has already signed the consent forms. She said the trust liquidates automatically. She said you should pack your personal items. I listened. I kept my posture straight. I felt the familiar tightening in my throat. I did not speak. I simply watched her hands flip through the pages. Her nails were painted a pale pink. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency. She closed the folder. She stood. She walked to the kitchen. She opened the refrigerator. She took out a bottle of water. She drank it in long sips. She set it down. She turned to me. She said, "You have been very cooperative." I nodded. I said, "I understand what needs to be done." She smiled. It did not reach her eyes. She said Arthur would be proud. She walked out the back door. The porch step creaked under her weight. I stood in the kitchen. I watched the screen door swing shut. I waited until her car drove away. Then I moved. I went to the bedroom. I pulled the suitcase from the closet. I did not pack clothes. I packed files. I packed the trust certification. I packed the original deed. I packed the bank routing documents. I packed the notarized copies of the tape transcript. I placed them in a waterproof canvas bag. I zipped it shut. I placed the bag under the bed. I covered it with a folded quilt. I walked to the study. I retrieved the cassette player. I placed it in my coat pocket. I walked to the front door. I locked it. I walked to the driveway. I got in the car. I started the engine. I drove to the county clerk's office. The building was closed. The streetlights cast long shadows on the brick facade. I sat in the driver's seat. I watched the rain begin to fall. It tapped against the windshield. I felt the weight of the canvas bag against my leg. I felt the cold plastic of the cassette player in my pocket. I exhaled slowly. I knew exactly where to go next. I knew who would listen. I knew who would act. The city felt different at night. It felt quieter. It felt like it was holding its breath. I put the car in gear. I turned toward the downtown district. I did not rush. I drove at the speed limit. I stopped at every red light. I followed every lane. I arrived at the office building at 9:15. The lobby was empty. The security guard nodded as I approached. I took the elevator to the 12th floor. The carpet muffled my footsteps. The hallway was dim. The door at the end of the corridor had a brass plaque. 4th and Madison, Suite 1200. I knocked. A voice answered from inside. I turned the handle. I stepped into the room. The air smelled of old paper and polished wood. A woman stood behind a large oak desk. She wore a tailored grey suit and reading glasses on a chain. She looked up. She did not smile. She said, "Eleanor, you are exactly on time." I closed the door behind me. I placed the canvas bag on the chair. I sat. I folded my hands. I began to speak. Margaret reached across the desk. Her fingers brushed the canvas edge of my bag. She did not rush. She unzipped it slowly. The sound of the zipper pulling through the fabric echoed in the quiet room. She laid the trust certification on the oak surface. She smoothed the wrinkles with the flat of her palm. She nodded once. She said, "The original filings are confirmed." She said the county recorder stamped the irrevocable clause yesterday evening. She said the joint operating accounts are already frozen. She looked up. Her eyes were sharp. She said, "Clara has no legal standing here." She said Julian's signature only applies to personal assets. "The house belongs to you. The accounts belong to you. The power of attorney is void." I did not smile. I did not exhale. I simply felt the tension drain from my shoulders. My hands rested on the armrests. The leather felt cool. I watched Margaret slide the documents into a fresh legal folder. She stamped it with a red seal. She handed it to me. I took it. The weight felt absolute. It felt final. I walked back to the parking garage alone. The concrete pillars were painted pale grey. The air smelled of exhaust and damp dust. I pressed the unlock button on my key fob. The headlights flashed once. I opened the car door. I placed the folder on the passenger seat. I buckled my seatbelt. I started the engine. The dashboard lights glowed green. I drove through the empty streets. The city looked different now. It looked ordered. It looked predictable. I stopped at a red light on 4th Avenue. A street sweeper moved slowly down the next block. Its brushes spun in steady circles. I watched the water spray against the asphalt. I felt something shift inside me. It was not relief. It was focus. I turned left onto Madison. I kept my speed steady. I did not check the rearview mirror. I knew where I was going. The security guard stood by the lobby exit. He wore a dark uniform and carried a heavy flashlight. He watched me approach. He nodded slowly. He said the lawyer's assistant left a note at the front desk. He said it is marked for your name only. He handed me a small white envelope. I took it. The paper felt thick. I slipped it into my pocket. I walked out into the cold air. The rain had stopped. The streetlights reflected in the puddles. I got into the car. I did not read the note immediately. I placed it on the dashboard. I drove home. The tires hummed against the wet road. The radio stayed off. I listened to the engine. I listened to my own breathing. The rhythm felt steady. The panic was gone. The preparation remained. The house waited for me in the dark. The porch light was off. The oak tree stood bare against the night sky. I parked in the driveway. I walked up the steps. The wood felt solid under my boots. I unlocked the door. I stepped inside. The hallway smelled of lemon cleaner and old paper. I walked to the kitchen. I turned on the small lamp above the sink. The yellow light pooled on the counter. I placed the legal folder beside the coffee maker. I opened the upper cabinet. I took down a fresh stack of manila envelopes. I began to sort. I separated the bank routing sheets. I separated the property deeds. I separated the notarized transcripts. I worked in silence. My fingers moved quickly. My breathing stayed even. I taped the copies together. I labeled each stack with a black marker. I placed them inside a waterproof tote bag. I zipped it shut. I hid it behind the stack of winter coats in the hall closet. The zipper pulled smooth. The bag sat heavy against the floorboards. I walked to the study. I closed the door. I sat in Arthur's chair. I pressed my thumb against the desk edge. The wood felt familiar. I listened to the house breathe. The furnace kicked on. The pipes hummed. I felt the weight of the ledger in my coat pocket. It pressed against my thigh. I did not move. I just watched the shadows stretch across the carpet. I thought about the way Clara's hands moved when she spoke. I thought about the precision of her lies. I thought about the quiet way they had tried to erase me. It was not anger that filled my chest. It was clarity. I knew exactly how to play the remaining cards. I knew exactly when to lay them down. I stood. I walked to the bedroom. I changed out of my coat. I hung it carefully on the hook. I turned off the lamp. I climbed into bed. I pulled the quilt to my chin. I closed my eyes. I did not sleep. I listened. At 2 in the morning, footsteps moved down the hall. They stopped outside my door. I held my breath. The doorknob turned slowly. It clicked. The door opened an inch. A sliver of hallway light cut across the rug. A voice spoke from the darkness. It was low. It was careful. Clara said the judge arrives at 9. She said he will not ask questions. She said Julian already signed the final waiver. The door closed softly. The footsteps faded. I lay perfectly still. My hands rested flat on the mattress. My eyes opened to the dark. Something about the way she whispered through the crack in the door made the back of my neck go cold. I knew she believed the morning would bring her victory. I smiled into the pillow. I turned toward the wall. The clock ticked. The house settled. I waited for the sun. The morning light arrived pale and watery through the blinds. I did not sleep. I watched the shadows stretch across the bedroom floor until they thinned into nothing. I rose at 6. I washed my face in cold water. I dressed in the navy wool dress Arthur had bought me 20 years ago. The fabric felt heavy and familiar against my skin. I fastened the silver buttons slowly. My fingers did not fumble. I walked downstairs. The kitchen smelled of stale coffee and damp wool. I left a pot on the stove. I did not drink from it. I retrieved the canvas tote from the closet. I checked the contents 3 times. The trust certification sat on top. The deed lay beneath it. The bank routing sheets were taped together in a neat stack. I zipped the bag. I placed my keys in my coat pocket. I stepped onto the porch. The air was cold and still. The oak tree stood bare against the grey sky. I locked the door. I walked to the car. The engine turned over on the first try. The tires hummed against the wet asphalt. I drove toward downtown Seattle. The city moved slowly in the morning rain. Traffic lights blinked from red to green. I followed the rhythm. I kept my hands at 10 and 2. My breathing stayed shallow and even. I arrived at Madison Street just after 8:15. The brick building stood tall and imposing against the overcast sky. I parked in the underground garage. The concrete echoed with the sound of other engines. I carried the bag to the elevator. The doors slid shut. The numbers climbed past 4, past 8, past 10. The pressure shifted in my ears. The chimes sounded at 12. The doors opened. The hallway smelled of lemon polish and old paper. A geometric carpet in deep blue muffled my footsteps. I walked to the end of the corridor. The brass plaque read, Suite 1200. I knocked once. The sound was sharp in the quiet hall. A woman opened the door. Margaret Lynn wore a tailored charcoal suit. Her hair was pulled into a tight silver coil. She wore reading glasses on a fine gold chain. She did not smile. She stepped back. She gestured to the waiting area. The leather chairs were worn at the edges. A small television sat silent in the corner. I sat. I placed the canvas bag on my lap. I waited. At 8:30, she opened the inner door. She led me to her office. The room was lined with bookshelves filled with legal codes and municipal records. A heavy oak desk dominated the center. A brass lamp sat unlit on the left edge. She sat behind the desk. I sat across from her. She folded her hands. I placed the canvas bag on the polished wood. The zipper sounded loud in the quiet room. I pulled it back. I removed the stack of papers. I set them down. She reached for the top file. She opened it. She read the first page. Her expression did not change. She turned the page. She smoothed the corner with her thumb. She looked up at me. She said, Eleanor, what you are holding is the Vance Marital Preservation Trust. She paused. She tapped the ledger with a single finger. The principal, as of yesterday's closing, stands at $4,210,000. She leaned back. She said Arthur established it on October 14th, 1998. She said he funded it after the county hospital settlement. She said he created it because he knew his own silence would eventually cost you everything. She closed the file. She said the trust is irrevocable. She said it bypasses probate entirely. She said no medical directive, no power of attorney, and no spousal claim can touch it. She said you are the sole trustee. The room went still. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. I did not speak. I felt my shoulders drop exactly half an inch. I felt my spine lengthen against the leather chair. I felt the air move into the bottom of my lungs without resistance. My hands unclenched. They rested flat on my knees. The tension that had lived behind my ribs for 9 months simply dissolved. It left behind nothing but a quiet, heavy certainty. I looked at the papers on the desk. I looked at the brass nameplate. I looked at the rain sliding down the window pane. I breathed in. I breathed out. I understood exactly what I was holding. It was not just paper. It was a wall. It was a boundary. It was a door that would not open for anyone else. Margaret slid a fresh manila folder across the desk. She said, "Sign here." She handed me a fountain pen with a black barrel. I took it. The nib was smooth. I wrote my name in the designated box. The ink dried quickly. She stamped the page with a red seal. She said, "It is done." She said the bank has been notified. She said Clara's access codes are already deactivated. I nodded. I stood. I gathered the papers. I placed them back in the canvas bag. I walked out of the office. The hallway felt longer on the way back. The elevator descended slowly. I stepped into the garage. The air smelled of exhaust and concrete. I unlocked the car. I drove home. The rain had stopped. The sky was the color of wet stone. I pulled into the driveway. The house stood quiet. I carried the bag to the kitchen. I placed it on the counter. I poured a glass of water. I drank it slowly. I washed the glass. I dried it. I returned it to the cabinet. I turned toward the living room. I heard her voice through the sunroom door. It was low and precise. She was speaking to someone on her phone. I stepped into the hallway. I pressed my ear against the painted wood. I controlled my breathing. I kept my hands at my sides. She said the judge is pushing back to Friday. She said the medical team arrives tomorrow. She said we will get the signature by noon. She said if she resists, we call the sheriff. The line clicked. I heard the receiver settle into the cradle. I did not move. I felt the cold paint against my cheek. I listened to the floorboards settle. I turned away from the door. I walked to the study. I sat at the desk. I traced the wood grain with my thumb. I knew what Friday meant. It meant they were running out of time. It meant they would push harder. It meant I had to be ready before the clock struck 12. For 3 hours it seemed like it might resolve on its own. The mail arrived. The bills were already paid. The clinic cancelled the morning appointment. A thick envelope slid through the slot containing a notice of hearing postponement. The sun broke through the clouds. It cast a warm rectangle on the kitchen table. I sat with a cup of tea. I watched the dust float in the light. The phone did not ring. The footsteps upstairs stopped. The air felt lighter. The tension that had gripped the walls finally loosened. I let myself believe the storm had passed. I let myself believe the paperwork had worked. I closed my eyes. I listened to the quiet. It felt like peace. It felt like the end of a long winter. Then the doorbell rang. It was a harsh, sustained sound. I stood. I walked to the hallway. I opened the door. A man in a dark suit stood on the porch. He held a clipboard. Behind him stood 2 women in pale blue scrubs. The man said he was delivering a court-ordered emergency evaluation. He said the judge signed a temporary guardianship waiver at 9 o'clock that morning. He said they were here to assess my cognitive capacity. He said they would not leave until they had a signature. He handed me a form. The paper felt thin and cheap. I read the header. It bore Clara's name. It cited immediate risk of self-harm. It demanded immediate transfer of medical and financial authority. I looked past the man. Clara stood at the bottom of the driveway. She wore a beige trench coat. She held a leather portfolio. She did not look at me. She looked at the clipboard. She nodded once. The man said, "Please step aside." He said this is legally binding. I felt the air leave my lungs. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath my feet. The false piece shattered into sharp, urgent pieces. They had bypassed the hearing. They had used an emergency clause. They were coming inside. I looked at the women in blue. I looked at the man's shoes. I looked at the clipboard in his hand. I stepped back. I let them in. The door closed behind them. The air in the hallway grew thick. The man set the clipboard on the entry table. He uncapped a pen. He handed it to me. He said, "Just sign at the bottom." I did not take it. I turned toward the stairs. I said, "I need a moment to find my glasses." He said, "Take 5 minutes." I walked up. My steps were steady. My breathing was even. I reached the landing. I did not go to the bedroom. I went to Arthur's old study. I locked the door. I sat at his desk. I pulled the brass drawer open. I moved the medical journals. I felt the back wall of the compartment. I pressed my fingers against the wood. A false panel shifted. I pulled it back. Inside lay a small velvet pouch. I untied the cord. A heavy iron key dropped into my palm. I closed my fist around it. I stood. I walked to the closet. I opened the bottom shelf. I pulled out Arthur's old medical satchel. The leather was cracked and worn. I opened the flap. I reached inside. My fingers brushed against a folded document taped to the inner lining. I pulled it free. It was a notarized letter of voluntary departure, dated the Tuesday he left, signed by him, witnessed by the county clerk. It stated clearly that he left of his own free will, in full possession of his faculties, and expressly revoked any claim of mental incapacity against the household. It invalidated the emergency waiver. It was the final piece. I held it in both hands. I read the signature. I read the date. I read the witness stamp. I placed it in my coat pocket. I felt the weight of it against my chest. I unlocked the door. I walked back downstairs. The man was still waiting. The women in blue stood near the window. Clara stepped into the foyer. She looked at me. Her eyes were sharp. She said, "We need the signature now." I did not speak. I walked past her. I went to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water. I drank it slowly. I placed the glass on the counter. I turned around. I walked to the entry table. I placed the iron key beside the clipboard. I did not look at the pen. I did not look at the forms. I looked at Clara. I said, "The emergency waiver is void." I said, "Arthur signed a voluntary departure letter." I said it was filed with the clerk. I said, "You have no standing here." She did not blink. She reached for the clipboard. I said, "You will leave." She stopped. Her hand hovered over the paper. She looked at the man. He shifted his weight. He looked at the clock. He said, "We need to verify the document." I said, "Verify it at the county office." I said, "I will meet you there in an hour." I said, "Bring the sheriff if you must." I said, "You will not step foot inside this house again." The silence stretched. It filled the hallway. It pressed against the walls. Clara's jaw tightened. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. She stepped back. She turned to the man. She said, "We leave." She said, "We file an appeal." She said, "This is not over." She walked out the door. The man followed. The women in blue stepped onto the porch. The door clicked shut. The lock turned. I stood in the foyer. I listened to their footsteps fade down the driveway. I listened to the car doors close. I listened to the engine start. I listened to it drive away. The house was quiet again. I walked to the kitchen. I washed my hands. I dried them. I turned off the light. I stood by the window. I watched the street. I felt the paper in my pocket. I felt the iron key in my hand. I breathed in. I breathed out. Arthur's voice returned to me, clear, steady, unbroken. Check the pulse before treating the wound. The words settled over my breathing. They carried a new weight now. They were not a warning. They were a command. They were the sound of a door locking. They were the rhythm of a heart beating exactly as it should. I understood then that preparation is not a single act. It is a series of quiet choices. It is a slow accumulation of knowing exactly where to press. It is waiting for the right moment to apply pressure. I walked to the study. I sat in the chair. I traced the desk edge. I opened the notebook. I wrote the time. I wrote the outcome. I closed the cover. I slipped it into the drawer. I stood. I walked to the front door. I checked the lock. I checked the deadbolt. I checked the chain. Everything felt solid. Everything felt secure. I turned toward the hallway. The floorboards creaked under my weight. I listened to the sound. It was familiar. It was honest. I knew what to do next. I knew exactly how to finish it. The sun dipped below the tree line. The shadows stretched across the porch. I stood at the threshold. I watched the streetlights flicker on. Something about the way the amber light caught the dust on the railing made the back of my neck go cold. I stepped inside. I closed the door. I locked it behind me. I waited for tomorrow. The hallway held the scent of wet wool and old wood polish. I stood still. The silence was no longer empty. It was charged. It felt like the air before a thunderstorm breaks. I walked to the kitchen. The linoleum was cold beneath my slippers. I opened the window over the sink. A sliver of damp night air slipped inside. It carried the smell of pine needles and distant exhaust. I watched the neighbor porch light across the street. It flickered twice, then steadied. I knew Mrs. Gable was watching from behind her curtains. She always did when the sirens passed. I did not wave. I simply let the glass slide shut. The latch clicked. I turned the deadbolt. My hands moved with deliberate slowness. Each motion was measured. Each breath was counted. I felt the iron key in my pocket. I felt the folded departure letter against my ribs. The weight was grounding. It was real.
It was mine. I moved to the study. I did not turn on the lamp. I sat in the dark. I listened to the house settle. The floorboards expanded as the temperature dropped. The furnace hummed a low, steady note. I traced the edge of the brass desk with my thumb. The metal was cool. The wood was smooth. I thought about the years I spent cataloguing municipal records. I thought about how every document told a story, if you knew how to read the margins. I thought about how Clara had only read the center page. She had missed the fine print. She had missed the dates. She had missed the witness signatures. She had built a house on sand and called it a fortress. I closed my eyes. I let the truth settle into my bones. It was not triumph. It was clarity. It was the quiet understanding that some people only respect boundaries when they hit a wall. I stood. I walked to the hallway closet. I pulled the heavy winter coat from the rack. I slipped my arm into the sleeve. I reached into the inner pocket. I felt the velvet pouch. I untied the cord. I placed the iron key on the entry table. I set the departure letter beside it. I aligned them perfectly. I stepped back. I looked at them in the dim light from the street lamp. They looked ordinary. They looked like paper and metal. But they were weapons. They were shields. They were the exact things Arthur had left behind to keep me safe. He had known his own drifting heart. He had known his silence would one day become a weapon against me. He had prepared. He had always prepared. Check the pulse before treating the wound. The words echoed in the quiet hall. They no longer sounded like advice. They sounded like a strategy. I walked to the sunroom. The glass was cold. I pressed my palms flat against it. I watched the driveway. A car turned onto the street. Its headlights swept across the oak tree. The beam caught the bare branches. It moved slowly. It stopped at my gate. The engine idled. I did not move. I did not hide. I simply watched. The passenger door opened. A figure stepped out. It was Clara. She wore a dark coat. She carried a cell phone to her ear. She walked to the front path. She did not knock. She did not ring the bell. She stood on the porch, her breath plumed in the cold air. I heard her voice through the glass. It was low. It was frayed at the edges. She said he refused to sign the transfer. She said the judge is going to question the emergency waiver. She said we need the original deed by morning. She said if we do not get it, the trust freezes permanently. She paused. She said Julian is panicking. She says she will handle it. She turned away from the door. She walked back to the car. The passenger door closed. The headlights swept across the lawn again. The car pulled away. I stood by the window. My hands remained flat against the glass. The condensation cooled my skin. I felt the vibration of her voice in my ribs. She was desperate. She was running out of road. She had just revealed the exact timeline. I knew exactly what morning would bring. I knew exactly where she would go first. I walked back to the kitchen. I opened the drawer beneath the stove. I pulled out a fresh sheet of printer paper. I placed it on the table. I retrieved a pen from the jar. I wrote the date. I wrote the time. I wrote down her exact words. I wrote the name of the judge she mentioned. I wrote the phrase, permanent freeze. I folded the paper. I slipped it into the trust folder. I zipped the canvas bag. I placed it on the highest shelf of the pantry. I pushed it behind a stack of canned tomatoes and extra flour. It sat heavy in the dark. It waited.
I turned off the kitchen light. I walked to the bedroom. I did not turn on the lamp. I lay on top of the quilt. I stared at the ceiling. The streetlight painted a pale square on the floor.
I watched it shift as clouds moved across the sky. I felt the rhythm of my own breathing. It was slow. It was deep. It was steady. I did not fear the morning. I prepared for it. I mapped the steps in my mind. I knew which documents to carry. I knew which phone number to dial. I knew which door to walk through. The house felt solid around me. The walls held. The roof stayed tight. The foundation was unbroken. I closed my eyes. I let the quiet wrap around me. Something about the way the wind rattled the loose pane in the study window made the back of my neck go cold. I knew she would not wait for Friday. She would come at dawn. I smiled into the dark. I turned toward the wall. I waited. The clock ticked. The night deepened. I was ready. The porch light flickered once before I turned it off. I stood in the hallway and listened to the tires crunch against the wet gravel. The engine idled low and steady. A car door opened, then another. The front steps groaned under two distinct weights. I did not rush to the door. I kept my breathing slow. I placed my palms flat against the wall and leaned forward. The wood was cold. It carried sound better than the plaster did. I heard Clara through the gap between the door and the frame. Her voice was sharp, stripped of its usual polished calm. She said the judge is going to deny it. She said they always do. She said we just need to get him to sign the secondary transfer. She paused. She said Julian can live in whatever he wants after the house sells. She said he does not have to see me again. The silence that followed was heavy. It was not agreement. It was surrender. I heard the screen door handle turn. I pulled the main door open before she could knock. The morning air rushed inside, carrying the smell of damp pine and exhaust. Clara stood on the threshold. Her coat was buttoned wrong at the collar. Julian stood behind her. He looked pale. His hands hung loose at his sides. I stepped back. I said, "Come in." I did not smile. I did not frown. I simply turned and walked to the kitchen. The room smelled of old coffee and lemon wax. The morning light fell in pale rectangles across the table. I pulled out the chair at the head. I sat. I placed my hands flat on the wood. I waited until they entered. Clara sat to my right. Julian sat to my left. Neither of them looked at me. They looked at the empty space in the center of the table. I reached under my coat. I felt the heavy edge of the canvas bag. I lifted it onto the table. The canvas scraped against the varnish. I unzipped it slowly. I reached inside. My fingers closed around the iron key. I pulled it out. I set it on the table. I reached back. I pulled out the folded departure letter. I smoothed the creases with both hands. I placed it beside the key. I folded my hands again. I looked at Clara. I said, "The emergency waiver expired at midnight." I said the county clerk refused to stamp the guardianship forms. I said the judge reviewed Arthur's medical history. I said the court found no evidence of decline. I said you have no standing here. I said you will leave. Her right hand froze halfway to her bag. The fingers curled inward.
They stopped moving entirely. Her head turned slowly toward Julian. Her eyes searched his face for confirmation. Her breath caught in her throat. She reached for her water glass. Her fingertips brushed the condensation. She lifted it an inch. She set it back down, too carefully. The base clicked against the cork coaster. She leaned forward. She said the filing is still pending. She said the medical team can override a single judge. She said a second opinion will change the timeline. She stood abruptly. The chair legs screeched against the floor. She reached across the table. She grabbed the edge of the departure letter. I moved it an inch to the left. She pulled her hand back.
She said Julian agreed to the split. She said he promised to sign the secondary transfer. She said, you are just a librarian. She said you do not understand corporate structures. She reached for my phone. I slid it out of her reach. I said you are trespassing. I said the security cameras are recording. I said the county has copies of everything. She shook her head. Her jaw tightened. She turned to Julian. She said, you told me you would handle it. She said, you said she would break. She said, you said she was too tired to read the fine print. He did not look at her. He looked at his hands. The knuckles were pale. He unclasped them slowly. He placed his palms on his knees. His shoulders dropped. The tension left his spine all at once. He breathed out. He looked up. His eyes met mine. The glassiness was gone. The confusion was gone. He said, I did not know she would lie about your mind. The word hung in the air. It did not bounce. It sank. I nodded. I did not speak. I reached into the bag one last time. I pulled out the thick legal folder. I opened it. I slid the main document across the table. The title faced them. The Vance Marital Preservation Trust. I said the principal stands at $4,210,000. I said Arthur established it on October 14th, 1998. I said it was funded by the hospital settlement. I said it bypasses all spousal and medical claims. I said it is irrevocable. I said dual signature is impossible. I said I am the sole trustee. I closed my hands. I waited. She stared at the paper. Her eyes tracked the bold type at the top. Her right hand lifted slightly. The fingers hovered over the stamped notary seal. They did not touch it. They trembled. She read the trustee line twice. She read the value printed in the margin. She looked at the date. She looked at my face. The room went perfectly still. The refrigerator motor cut out. The clock on the wall ticked 3 times. Julian kept his hands clasped on his knees. His spine straightened against the chair back. Clara stopped breathing. The air felt thick. It pressed against the windows. It settled over the table. It trapped us in a quiet that had no exit. She opened her mouth to argue. The sound caught in her throat. She tried to form a word. It fractured into a dry whisper. She closed her lips. She swallowed hard. She looked down at her lap. She smoothed a wrinkle in her skirt that did not exist. The only sound in the room was the slow drip of water from the kitchen faucet. It fell into the stainless steel basin. It echoed against the metal. It measured the silence. I did not move. I simply watched the dust settle on the table edge. The confrontation ended not with a shout, but with a quiet surrender to gravity. I stood. I gathered the papers. I placed them back in the canvas bag. I said, "You have until noon." I said, pack what is yours. I said, leave the rest. I walked to the hallway. I did not look back. The first week moved in straight lines. Clara filled cardboard boxes with her own clothes. She packed the porcelain cups. She folded the linen towels. She carried them to the driveway one by one. The sky stayed grey. The wind carried the leaves across the concrete. I watched from the kitchen window. I did not help. I did not speak. I simply stood and watched the stack grow. She loaded the final box into a rental van. The door slid shut with a metallic thud. The engine started. The tires rolled away. The house felt different. It felt lighter. It felt like a lung finally filling with air. I walked to the living room. I moved the heavy oak sideboard back against the wall. I unrolled the rug. I swept the dust from the floorboards. The broom made a steady sound. I stopped sweeping. I listened to the quiet. It was not empty. It was mine. 3 weeks later, the porch steps still dipped 2 inches to the left. I watched Julian stand on the driveway. He carried a toolbox. He wore work gloves and a faded flannel shirt. He knelt on the damp concrete. He placed a wooden block under the sagging frame. He drove 3 long screws into the wood. The drill whined. The wood groaned. He tightened the last bolt. He wiped his hands on his jeans. He stood. He tested the step. It held firm. It did not move. He looked up at the front door. He did not smile. He simply nodded once. He picked up his tools. He walked to his car. He left the keys on the hall table. I found them the next morning. They sat on the brass tray beside the mail. I did not call him. I did not write a note. I left them exactly where he put them. That evening the rain returned. It fell softly against the roof. I sat in Arthur's chair. The leather was worn smooth at the edges. I traced the armrest with my thumb. The brass desk stood quiet. The bottom drawer remained closed. I looked at the oak tree through the window. The branches were heavy with water. They did not break. They bent. They held. I closed my eyes. I breathed in. I breathed out. Arthur's voice returned to me then, clear, steady, unbroken. Check the pulse before treating the wound. The words no longer felt like a warning. They felt like a foundation. They felt like the exact rhythm I had been waiting for. I understood then that the pulse was never about fear. It was about knowing what was alive and what was just noise. It was about waiting for the quiet to settle before deciding what to cut. I opened my eyes. I stood. I turned off the lamp. The house settled around me. The walls stayed solid. The floor stayed level. I knew exactly how to keep it that way. Sometimes the deepest truth about survival is not the shouting, but the quiet way you refuse to hand over the keys. It does not arrive with grand speeches or dramatic courtroom victories. It arrives when you stop apologizing for taking up space. It arrives when you realize the person rearranging your furniture never actually wanted to live in the room with you. They only wanted to measure the dimensions before the sale. Clara did not hate me. She simply needed to feel safe in a world that had taught her nothing lasts. She mistook my patience for vacancy. She mistook my silence for surrender. People like her walk into families carrying ledgers instead of hearts. They count the years. They weigh the assets. They calculate the distance between generosity and control. They believe that if they hold the paperwork, they can never be left behind. But paper burns.
Ink fades. Signatures lose their power when they are built on a foundation of quiet theft. The house never belonged to her. The trust never belonged to her. The life never belonged to her. She was only ever a guest who forgot how to knock. Here is the truth no one tells you when you spend 40 years building a home with someone else's dreams. The people who walk away thinking they have outsmarted you rarely understand what they are leaving behind. They mistake the steady hands that kept the shelves full and the accounts balanced for weakness. They think the absence of a raised voice means the absence of a spine. They forget that architects do not build walls to keep people out. They build them to hold the roof up when the wind changes direction. Arthur left. He thought the distance was his burden. He thought his silence was a form of mercy. He did not see that I had already secured the floorboards. He did not see that I had already anchored the foundation. He taught me to listen to the rhythm before making the incision. I applied it to the house. I applied it to the trust. I applied it to the quiet years that people told me were wasted. They were not wasted. They were preparation. Every receipt I saved, every file I catalogued, every date I noted in the margins. It was all practice for the moment the storm finally broke. If there is one lesson I hope this story leaves with you, it is this. The things you guard quietly are never truly yours until you stop being afraid to use them. The years you spend measuring time in small tasks are not invisible. They are armor. The hands that sort the mail and water the plants and wash the cups are the same hands that will turn the page, sign the document, and close the door when the moment arrives. You do not need to announce your strength. You do not need to raise your voice. You only need to know where it sits. You only need to remember who built the floor beneath your feet. You only need to wait until the room is quiet enough to hear your own name spoken in it. If this story moved you in any way, I want to hear from you. Have you ever watched someone rearrange your life and pretend it was for your own good? Where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it there? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. If narratives like this speak to you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe so you do not miss the next story. We are keeping a quiet record here, a place where the steady hands finally get their due. You do not have to shout to be unbreakable.